I was interested in Eototo and Aholi. Eototo is the chief of all Kachinas, but his best friend is Aholi. And there's a wonderful story about when the two Kachinas were accompanying the Hopi on their migrations. They were in Central America, I believe, or South America. And they got attacked. And it looked like the Hopi were going to be destroyed. And Aholi went to his friend Eototo and said, "You lead the Hopi out of here. I'm going to stay and fight a rear guard action and I'll save you." And Eototo said, "Oh, well, I guess we have to." Eototo led them away to safety, and Aholi stayed and he fought and died. But of course, if you're a Kachina, it's a relative term. And he came to life again afterwards and spent centuries trying to catch up to the rest of the Hopi clan and found at last his best friend, Eototo. And they embraced, and they always traveled together after that. Something very touching about the idea of these spiritual beings liking each other. That's what influenced the idea of Aholi, because this is a book about spirituality. It may be comic in places. It talks a lot about a background, but the idea that there's something in the backyard is that there may be a spiritual reality there that we just can't see. And it's no mistake, his name being Aholi sort of led me on to this thinking of how to develop this. The actual story itself came to me. I was reading a collection of short stories by a writer named Evan Cannell. He did a Mrs. Bridge, I believe, in the 60s, and later Son of the Morning Star. He had a short story that I don't remember much about, but it had to do with a cocktail party. And in the backyard of this cocktail party, in these suburbanites, was a huge bird sitting on a perch. It could have been a vulture. I don't remember. But it was the idea of this totally incongruous being in the middle of this party, and no one knew what to do with it. So from there, it became sort of the next step. Well, suppose it was a Kachina that you found there. A number of readers have commented that there are parts about the book that are very funny, and have wondered if I set out to write a humorous book. I really didn't. It just sort of evolved, and that was the most gratifying thing about writing a book, is that the characters really took over and told me what they were doing. People have wondered whether I knew anybody about, like George and like Mary Olive and the other characters. And I'm not going to mention their names here, but yes, there were some characters, some people that I knew who, when I thought about what would my reaction be to finding something in the backyard, these people came to mind. I had to live with them for a little while, and some of the external things that George and Mary Olive do were actually part of these people. He used to sit up and he studied. He had a little monocular and he would spy on his neighbors. They would talk to each other through the register on the floor. She had a thing about leaving the Electrolux vacuum cleaner out so that it became really a presence in the house. You had to deal with this vacuum cleaner no matter where you were. But within probably a page and a half of that, starting to write the book, the characters became totally their own. For instance, the real George never would have gone down to look at what was there. He would have closed the blinds, peeked out, and called the police. If anybody had gone down, it would have been Mary Olive. Mary Olive herself was very intellectually curious. She would have been very sort of fascinated with it, not afraid of it at all. The other couple, Don Pike and Sally, they too were sort of a couple that I knew, but not really. I knew very little about them. The thing about writing fiction for me is that it's really like a waking dream. You know, you sit there all by yourself, day after day, listening to imaginary conversations. If you did that under any other context, somebody would be pressing charges or you'd find yourself in real trouble. But there you are, listening to people you can't see talk. The other thing about fiction and the idea of a waking dream, you learn in dream therapy, in psychoanalysis and in intensive psychotherapy, that everything in a dream, everyone in a dream, is actually yourself. It's a facet of yourself. And George represented to me my own befuddlement of being in the Southwest and really being totally out of my league, totally not prepared for this at all. I'd go to Indian dances, but I didn't belong there. It wasn't my culture. And George sort of represented that to me. Mary Olive was that intellectually curious, going after it. She never actually had an affair with her neighbor that I know of, but it seemed this was a different person as I started to write about her. The same was true for the Pikes. Dawn represented to me what I might have become if I had become an academic, and the frustration and trying to be creative. He also saw the, how can I say that? Almost the phoniness of so many of the people who get involved in the Indian culture. When I was there in the 70s, late 70s, we called them white Indians because of their embracing of the culture that isn't really theirs. And that's who Sally represented to me. Sally just sort of embraced it from her own needs, and she represented to me what I might have become if I had stayed in the Southwest. I'd wear squash blossom necklaces and puffy shirts and go to dances all my life. And it just wasn't my culture. And that's another thing that the book is about. It is about the clash of cultures. And there's something in the backyard. There's a lot of things in the backyard that we really do not understand. One of the things about this particular Kachina, you could say he's encroaching in a way into the Anglo George's culture. But there's also the element of this particular Kachina that just floored me in writing it. And that was when they're in the woods and George is in trouble. And he's had a fight with Dawn, and he's also tried to save Dawn. And you don't know, you know he's fallen, but you don't know how conscious he is at this point. And he looks closely at the mask, in the mask, and he can't see any eyes in there. So it leaves the question, is somebody in there? Or perhaps that is the Kachina. And Eototo and the Crow Mother find a holy. They come out of the woods and they sort of reunite in the same way that George reunites with his friend and his wife. And it was a revelation for me to write that at the end, that, yeah, he could have made it through the fence, but he was going to wait for some help.